That's okay. I don't know. I started it.
Yeah.
Do you have it going too?
Yep.
Okay. Let's bow in, everyone. So good evening. And chapters 50, 51, and 52. And I think we're leading
49.
off with Dan, right?
Yeah, 49 and 50. And then,
Oh, sorry, 49 and 50, right.
yes.
Right.
Okay. So I'll go this to gallery. So, welcome. So these are, I'm going to be doing chapter 49 and 50. And 49 is self-perpetuating awareness. And chapter 50 is the snowballing of deception. You know what I'd like to do if we could? Just sit for a moment, take a decent posture, eyes open, settle into the body. Just feel the sensations of the body. Just feel tactile sensations of the body. Feel the temperature of the air on the skin. Just come fully present into the body. You can hear your breathing. You can feel your breathing. You can feel whether your breath is warm or cool or neutral. You can feel if there are any tingling sensations in the hands or feet or wherever you feel them. And just come fully into the body. We focus on bodily sensations and sense perceptions, sights, sounds, tastes, smells, tactile sensations. And we just let them arise as they are without trying to change them, make them more comfortable, make them less comfortable. I'm not trying to alter them at all. Just let them arise as it is. And this is present moment awareness. As John says, you can relax now. So Trungpa Rinpoche begins this out with, since the world has its own intelligence, and that's what we were experiencing just now, things arise as they are. We don't need to figure them out, just need to see them. We don't need to add a new perspective to it, he says. He says, we're not trying to discover Martians. We're not trying to discover, something alien to us, something that we don't have. We're just trying to get in touch with what we already have. He says, reality begins with the reality that you have a body. And that's where it begins. And we need to feel embodied to be fully in present, because our body and the sensations are always right here in the present moment. And we add stuff to them because we're trying to control our experience in some way. So he's saying we don't have to do that. We have our sense perceptions. He says you can see, you can hear, you can taste, you can feel, you can smell, and you can exist. And if you think about it, there are only 6 things ever going on, right? We're either seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, touching, feeling, having bodily sensations, and having thoughts and feelings. And those are the only 6 things that are going on all the time. And just as an aside, when we bring all these things together and we put our kind of filters on it and biases and preconceptions, they all come together And this is what contributes to our sense that there's an enduring self. You know, all the ways we interact with the world, which are just those 5 ways plus thinking and feeling. There's no other way we have of interacting with the world. That's the only things that are ever going on. When we put them all together and they interact with each other, this contributes to our, sense of self being existing, as this thing that we all perceive. The feeling this of what it's like to be me, right? What it's like to be you. This is our sense of self. But it's really made up of all these ways of having, all these ways of interacting with the world, right? And he illustrates this by saying, when you eat, you eat. Keep it simple. When you hear, you hear. When you smell, you smell. And his point being, what he says is that the experience is reality as it is. That's real enough. We don't have to change it. I heard Joseph Goldstein tell the story once about there was a visiting teacher at the Insight Meditation Society, a Korean Zen master. His name is Sangsane. And he used to go around all the time, even when he wasn't teaching, telling people, when you sit, just sit. When you walk, just walk. And he was talking about just not adding any other filters to it, any other lenses to it. Just be aware of what you're doing and do one thing at a time so you can do it 100% and be mindful. And one day they all came down to breakfast, and Sangsane was sitting there eating breakfast and reading a newspaper. And some of his students were giving him a hard time about saying, when you eat, just eat. Why are you eating and reading? And he says simply, when you're eating and reading, just eat and read. So that's a very Zen master way of putting it. Suzuki Roshi says, don't let your thoughts bother you, just let them come and go. Right? As simple as that. And he goes on to explain that Kongtrul would say,
Oh, Dan, excuse me, Dan.
yeah,
You're scraping the mic and it's really loud.
Yep. Thanks, Barry. He goes on to explain that Kongtrul Rinpoche writes about the phenomenal world that we're in just being empty space, and it's because of this emptiness that we can put together forms and shapes and all our sense perceptions. They don't really exist, but this is our way of perceiving them. And when we these are our conceptual ways of seeing them. When we put all our sense perceptions together plus our thinking, that's when we fill the space, the emptiness that's inherently there, the blank slate, and we put forms and concepts into that space. And this is how we interact with the world. And when through the discipline of practice, I think he's referring to, he says the fuel of fixed concepts is burned up by the fire of discipline. That means, to me, I took that as when we're practicing and we're being disciplined, we're learning just to see, just to hear, just to smell, without adding all our, the intellectual conceptualizations about it. And so when we practice the discipline of practicing, or just when if we're not sitting in formal practice, just throughout the day, when we're focusing on being mindful and just seeing experience as it arises without changing it or putting it together in any other way, then our conceptual mind, our conceptual way of thinking of things with all the filters and lenses, that dissipates, and what we are left with is refined discrimination and what's called how he spells it, Rikpa, but has other people spell it with a G, or Rigpa, but the same thing. And he's saying this is the total experience of Vipassana. This is
Dan,
what, yes.
I'm going to interrupt you. Can you go into the video? I mean, the audio, and turn
Okay.
up your volume.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a little low.
Okay. That better?
I don't know. How the other people say some more.
That better?
Yes.
Is the volume low? Yeah. No. Better? Yeah. So he's saying this is what the total experience of Vipassana is, just seeing things as they are after we have burned the, the, the by the fire, we have burned up conceptualizations and we're left with more refined discrimination. And he says there is such a thing as complete awareness beyond the technique of simple breathing meditation and walking meditation. He's referring to shamatha, and that technique that's beyond is the self-perpetuating awareness of Vipassana. He says the Vipassana is a practice of growing up. He says through Vipassana, you begin to realize just how much of the world you have missed, and you begin to pay attention to it. So he says by practicing Vipassana along with shamatha, that we are experiencing much more of the world that we usually go about in our daily lives just not paying attention to, because we're so busy putting our filters and our lenses on things that we just don't see experience as it is, and we miss out on so much and really enjoying life and all the pleasant and unpleasant feelings, whatever they are, all together. And it also helps us to, in his words, we don't need to take our life too seriously. We learn that we should not be too frivolous either, but we maintain both our discipline and our cheerfulness. And I think this is important because people often have the misconception that if we see things just as they are without the filter that we're putting on it in terms of whatever our experiences is from the past, or however we see things in our unique way that has to do with our psychology, that we're not, if we get back to just experience as it is, it doesn't mean life is going to be boring or life is going to be just kind of this objective neutral experience. It lets us experience both the joyfulness and the unpleasant feelings in all their fullness. And we have a much more whole, realistic vision of the world, instead of narrowing ourselves by our preconceptions and the filters and lenses that we put over things. And so, he's kind of, in my mind, he was kind of debunking that myth that if we practice and become, just, try to see reality as it is without altering it or changing it in any way, that, the myth is then life will be boring. But he's saying by doing this, we actually experience life in a fuller way and more, just a more, just a fuller way. Sorry. And then to the next chapter called The Snowballing of Deception, he's saying that, but there's something that happens, beyond this experiencing level. And he says, and this is because emotionally we have the need to accept or reject. We just don't simply see things. We wind up in our minds telling, these stories or these narratives where we accept experiences that we feel as pleasant, and we reject experiences that we feel as unpleasant. So we're constantly in the state of running away from the unpleasant, trying to seek the pleasant, because the unpleasant is unpleasant. And we have this idea that we can just get rid of it, avoid it. We just don't want to experience it for any amount of time whatsoever. So we quickly move to ways in which we can get rid of these unpleasant feelings or avoid these unpleasant feelings and just experience the pleasant feelings. And this is a mistake. He says, it's very hard for us to keep things at this ideal level that we think we can and that we're trying to achieve. This trying to balance out the unpleasant by getting rid of them and then balancing out the pleasant by trying to hold on to them. And he says, my interpretation of what he says is this keeps us in a constant state of agitation because we have this illusion that there is this ideal balance and we can never achieve it. So we're in a constant state of dissatisfaction and constantly searching to do something that we can't do. Okay. He says it's almost impossible to maintain an even sense of happiness. And he says we're often trying to do that. So even though we can, achieve this to some degree, he goes, we still feel anxiety because at the time we feel satisfaction in that we've achieved this strategy to, feel content and feel fulfilled and feel, not wanting for anything. He says, but the basic anxiety is still there because at the point, the example he uses first, he goes, at the point where my stomach is full of food, but we start automatically thinking of what happens when I'm hungry again. Where am I going to get my next meal? So instead of being content just the way things are in the moment, that lasts for whatever, microsecond that lasts for, before we jump into the thought about what happens when this feeling of contentment fades away. We get hungry again. We want more of something else, because then our mind automatically goes to how are we going to achieve how are we going to achieve this level of contentment or fulfillment once it starts to fade away, and which is inevitable. So not accepting the inevitability of that, thinking that we can prevent it in some way, keeps us in a constant state of anxiety and agitation and trying to achieve something we can't achieve. He says it's like a jigsaw puzzle and the pieces just don't perfectly meet, and that's the way life is. And even if they did meet, we would still be anxious, he says, because we would go to supposing something goes wrong, right? So we have this jigsaw puzzle, we put everything in its correct place, it's got the perfect picture, and all of a sudden we start thinking, what if the table falls over and the pieces all fall apart? We just automatically go to wanting to maintain the level of completeness and worrying about how we're going to maintain that level instead of just accepting the ups and downs and the impermanence and ever-changing nature of life. He says, the conclusion is that everybody is neurotic because we're doing this thing, right? That neurosis creates discomfort and anxiety, and that basic anxiety is happening all the time. As long as we think that we can achieve this level, this balanced level, this level of constantly being at ease, constantly feeling fulfilled, that it's just a paradox, because if we're concerned about that, then we're always going to be worried about it lasting. And if it doesn't last, how are we going to make it come back as quickly as possible? Because we don't want to experience any discomfort, even for a second. My words, not his. he says, in order to rectify that basic anxiousness, we create heavy-handed situations, intense aggression, intense passion, and we come up with intense pride. And here is my words, enter the kleshas, right? The kleshas are the conflicting, as he defines it, the conflicting or confused emotions which entertain our basic anxiety and exaggerate it altogether. So in order to maintain this level, this even-keeled level of contentment, wholeness, happiness, whatever it is, the feeling that you want to maintain, this is where the kleshas come into account, because our ways of trying to attain this even level of, contentment or happiness or whatever, that we wind up, our ways of controlling us are painful, because we can't control it and we can't maintain these levels. So we become, when we feel out of control of this, we could be angry. These are my words, my examples, not his. We could become angry, we can become aggressive, anything that makes us feel out of control of our own experience, especially controlling our own experience of having pleasant feelings all the time. We're going to resort to these very misguided, intense, confusing, conflictual feelings like anger, aggressiveness, and, passion, trying to hold on to things, desire, and, passion not in the sense of passion of enjoying life, but passion in the sense of, just really wanting to hold on to these pleasant experiences and never wanting them to change, grasping. And he says, because of this, because of this basic anxiety that the pleasant feelings are going to go away and we're going to have to find a way to regain that back, we begin to find ourselves in even more trouble and more pain. So the very thing that we do that we think is, that we do to seek pleasure and to seek, contentment, happiness, whatever it means to you, instead causes us a lot of pain. So it's a paradox. In expressing our aggression and lust, which could be a reaction to the way we want to control our experience, we find ourselves feeling bad. So we do something to try to control our experience of pleasantness, and we wind up feeling bad because we express our aggression or our lust, and we, fulfill that urge immediately, but then we realize it didn't help us, and we just wind up feeling worse. And not only do we feel bad, he says, but we feel more anxious. He goes, it's a constant state of anxiety. Each time we try to make ourselves feel better, we feel worse. We end up with what is known as the vicious cycle of samsara. Right? Everybody is constantly making everyone else feel bad, because in our efforts to gain what we want, we express them in ways like through the kleshas, where we wind up hurting other people. And then in turn, they generate their own anxiety, but they also, act out of their own kleshas and make us feel bad. So it's a constantly self-perpetuating and perpetuating in others, and then them perpetuating back in us. So, it's just this constant cycle of samsara. And that's pretty much the definition of samsara. And he calls it a tremendous project. He goes, it's a constant mishap. It's a terribly bad mistake. And we've been participating in this for a long time, right? At least since we've been born, probably. And he goes, and we are still doing it. So we're constantly, participating in this mishap, mistake, this tremendous project that is aimed towards, misguidedly aimed towards us maintaining control of our experience so that we never have to experience any discomfort at all whatsoever. And he says, in spite of the consequences, in spite of the messages that come back to us, we still do it. I found that line very interesting towards the end, because that's pretty much the definition of addiction, right? That we think it's going to make us happy, and despite its negative consequences, we keep on doing it over and over and over again, even though we should know from experience that it does nothing except cause us more pain and more anxiety. And then he briefly goes on to say that there's one person who figured that out. He figured out the cessation of this endless cycle of samsara, this endless cycle of anxiety. And he said, and that person was the Buddha. And he said, and if the Buddha can do it, if we follow his path, which has been transmitted, over the 2,600 years, from generation to generation, from teacher to teacher, that we can do it too. And with that, I will give you Barry to show us how to do it. Maybe. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. That's great. Yeah, this chapter is what exactly is he calling it? Yes, recognizing the reality of suffering. And actually, I want to back up one step here. That this section that we're studying now is we'd have to change one thing. Yeah. The section we're studying right now is, we've just entered the section on the Four Noble Truths, and the first noble truth being the truth of suffering, one of my favorite subjects. And preparing for this, I had this thought, and I started to wonder, like, this is the first teaching of the Buddha. It's called the first turning of the wheel of Dharma. This is his first presentation, and it starts with the truth of suffering. But we're not getting to it until 370 something pages into this book. And I just had the thought, like, why? Why not start with this? This is what the Buddha started with. And I think it's because we weren't ready for it. It's said in the teachings that to receive the Dharma, that can't be done with the untamed mind, because this is really the heart of the Dharma here, is the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, and everything that comes from that. And so we have to have the ability that comes from practice, from meditation and studying, all of that, so that there's room to receive those teachings, that we're not so preoccupied with all of our stuff. And in fact, that we've already done some work on reducing our own suffering simply by becoming more present and waking up. So, anyway, here we are. And this teaching, and the other, question number 2 that came to me is, so why is this so fundamental? Why is it so important? And it really is in the teachings that the truth of suffering, the fact that we all experience suffering, and just how pervasive it is, that we're all of us, like all the time, most of the time in subtle ways that we don't notice. It's just sort of part of how things are. That's going on all the time. And the fact of the matter is that it is that which creates so much human misery and misunderstanding and conflict and suffering that propagates. We seem to be very generous with our suffering, you might say. So it's only after we spend some time practicing, and what's come before in this book has gone into a lot of different aspects of meditation and the approach to it and how we do this. And all of this is to, I think of it kind of like opening up the blinds and letting some light in, letting in the great eastern sun, you might say. So recognizing the reality of suffering, that's where we are now, chapter 51. And it means seeing it, right? He says there is suffering and pain. Someone actually has to say that. Unless we have an understanding and acceptance of pain, we have no way to transcend pain. Now, what exactly does that mean? That by seeing our pain, by seeing our suffering, and what Dan just went over in the previous chapter was there's a lot of detail there about all the different ways this happens, but by starting to become aware of it, and instead of not seeing it, of turning away from it, or immediately just addressing it as a problem that needs to be solved, but actually seeing it, that can give us something to work with. And I'll say this, the first time I encountered the Four Noble Truths was in a little booklet about the teachings of the Buddha. And I was very curious. And it began with the Four Noble Truths, and it presented Noble Truth number 1 as life is suffering. And I thought, great, I guess Buddhism's not for me. Who needs that? But it is central to the teachings. And in fact, suffering is what led the Buddha, what propelled him on the spiritual quest that eventually led to his becoming enlightened, is after growing up very sheltered within the palace, when he finally went out and started to see all the suffering of all the people around him, that is what finally led him to leave it all behind and go out on this quest and eventually become enlightened. So, seeing the suffering. That all of us struggle with suffering in our lives. But the Buddha taught that there's more to it than that. The suffering is pervasive, and in our lives, we're responding to suffering, walking a life of suffering, breathing suffering, and that actually noticing our own suffering can be a gift. Every annoyance can be a teaching. Every experience of self-consciousness, of what do people think of me, that kind of suffering, can actually be a teaching. It could be something to recognize, a new opportunity to wake up. So I believe that without an understanding of suffering, without an experience of the truth of suffering, there is no path. I might be corrected on that, but it seems that way to me. So, fact is, in general, we experience life as a struggle. Why? Well, he says we struggle because in our being we feel that we are what we are and we cannot change. We feel that we cannot change. Well, of course we can change. We learn new things. This body is growing old and changing. Our circumstances change. But what we can't change is reality, right? Well, wrong. Because reality is not how things are. what we normally think of as reality. It is reality as we think of it, is how we experience things, how we experience life, ourselves, everything. This is what we believe we cannot change. We think that our experience of what is there, what is reality, is just what is. And that our experience, good or bad, is the result of our circumstances. See, we believe that we cannot change how everything affects us. So we try to change our circumstances so that we can gain what we imagine will lead to our having a pleasant experience of life, of things working, of everything being the way it should be. And we do this, as Dan was saying, we do this again and again and again. And if there's any positive result, it's only temporary, so we try again. So now one note here is that we're not talking about ignoring our circumstances. We all need to take care of business, and that frequently may require hard work. But hard work is not the same as suffering. Suffering is like Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the mountain and never quite getting there. You know, for eternity, trying to get to the top of the mountain, well, that's us seeking happiness. And while we're blaming our circumstances, we blame ourselves for not doing better. And along with that self-doubt and that self-recrimination comes resentment. It ain't fair. And that can lead to real pain and suffering. He says, if I can find that quote, there is no relief or relaxation when we are in the samsaric world. There is always some kind of struggle going on. So that struggle is us always trying to get our circumstances to be just right. We're evaluating everything, deciding what to try to possess and draw near, or what we should avoid, or what we can safely ignore. If that sounds familiar, that's the three poisons: passion, aggression, ignorance. And of course, things are never quite right. And even at those times when they seem to be, we know that things may change. In fact, probably will. In fact, always do. And as long as that is our approach, there is no end to struggle. It is a point of view from the self looking out, always judging how that will affect me, and comparing ourselves with others. That energizes self-doubt. Just the impetus to compare oneself with someone else is full of anxiety. Are they better than me? Am I doing a good job of this right now? How do I look? No, I'm better than that. But let me check. Maybe I'm not. So even quiet little things. I should be better at this. Am I doing it right? Do they think I'm cool? Am I doing a good job of presenting this class? You see? What he says is that what we find is that the more into ourselves we are, the more we suffer, and the less into ourselves we are, the less we suffer. That this struggle is the chronic dissatisfaction of samsara. And that is the first noble truth. The first noble truth is simply a statement that this suffering is something that is always there. It is pervasive. And the desire to alter circumstances, to alter ourselves, is habitual, and it can be subtle. In fact, we're usually not even aware of it. We compare ourselves to others, our circumstances with others. try this. The next time something annoys you, look into that. Why exactly is it annoying? You know, every time that I've done that, it always turned out to be because something wasn't the way it should be, according to me. According to me, you can usually find that this, in my case, this is true, that the same thing at a different time or a different place or circumstances would be hardly noticed or even funny. And this is the kind of suffering, we don't think of this as suffering, it's just the way life it is. But what if we could escape all of that? See, we generate all this suffering after all, so we should be able to do something about it. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself there. So our response to suffering is usually to seek pleasure. He says that search for pleasure is the illogic or bad logic of samsaric existence. The logic that we can find happiness by buying a new car, or finding a new mate, moving to a new job, new country, new house, new circumstances, that we're always looking over the fence and seeing greener pastures over there. We're saying to ourselves, my life is lacking. I'm lacking. So he says, regarding pleasure from the point of view of pain is a kind of animal instinct. It is the instinct of lower realms existing within the human situation. It's very fundamental stuff. So because we experience the world from our samsaric viewpoint, we don't really see it. You know, it's like they talk about how a fish doesn't know of the existence of water until they jump out of it, right? So we can't know samsara until we glimpse a moment without it, and until we really then can start to really look at that suffering. And this does relate back to being prepared to receive this teaching. That even trying to really get this, to understand it, we have to have gotten to some kind of point where we can do that kind of thing, to actually examine our own experience in that way. But even then, we're unwilling to see it, to acknowledge our suffering frequently, because of what we think it says about ourselves. And because we believe we cannot change, as he said at the beginning. So, unless we realize the facts of life, he says, we cannot begin to practice Dharma. So it's time to face the facts. Basing anxiety is taking place in your everyday life all the time. See, suffering is sometimes very subtle, as I was saying, like background noise, like wallpaper, little things, doubts. You notice an expression on another's face. What does that say about me? Did I just do something wrong? So I'm kind of repeating myself here, but these are the kinds of things that you can start to become aware of when you really examine the experience of suffering, and then can begin to really recognize the reality of it, that like, it's true. Life is suffering here in samsara, because it is there and it influences us. It can be like gravity that pulls us off course and stirs up all kinds of stuff because of our need to try to escape it, change it, do something. So, and when you begin to see this in operation, it can be shocking or hilarious. And in fact, noticing our own suffering can be a gift, that every annoyance can be a teaching, every experience of self-consciousness, etc., etc. By seeing our pain and suffering and not turning away from it, we begin to understand our situation. This is where we are in samsara. Then things can start to become workable. We may begin to see the possibility of escaping samsara, the possibility of liberation. Stay tuned for the second and third noble truths for more on that. So here we are looking for ways to work with our situation. Now what? Well, he says, to begin with, you could give up your scheme of what you ideally want in your life. Give up your scheme of what you want in your life. This may seem odd. I mean, here we are putting effort into studying the Dharma and all of that, and we're being told, like, give up your schemes of trying to become enlightened or transcending suffering. I mean, how come? Well, because that's all about how I can achieve that. You see? And it is approaching the Dharma as a self-improvement project. So it's all about me changing what's wrong with me or what needs to be changed. So he goes on, in turn, you could try to be kind to others, or at least stop inconveniencing others. As he said earlier, the more into yourself you are, the more you will suffer. So the main point, he says, of the First Noble Truth is to realize that you do have such anxiousness in your being. Look into that. You can actually see your suffering, your anxiety, like you can see your thoughts during meditation. At this point, he says, we are not talking about an antidote. So I was getting a little ahead of myself there, I guess. But at this point, he says, we're not talking about an antidote or how to overcome that anxiety. The first thing is just to see that you are anxious. You're in samsara, and you actually have to realize that. So now that we have started to acknowledge our suffering and begun to see samsara for what it is, we have a reference point. Pema Chodron has said in her teachings, I think the title of one of her books, start where you are. And samsara is where we are. And by not turning away or denying the messiness of our experience, we have something to work with. So what else do we have here? Yes, now that we are providing a reference point, look at what you are doing. Look at where you are and what you're in the midst of. That is a very important message, he says. It is the beginning of the best enlightened message that could ever come about. So, we can get a reference point. Now what? Well, first of all, to work with that reference point, you have to continue to tame your mind. And he guesses how? Practice, meditation practice, of course. And that goes on in one form or another all the way down this path. Practice never ends. The mind is kind of like a garden. If you let it go on its own for too long, weeds start to take over. So the Buddha Dharma is a path that has been carefully laid out for us. The real value in using the real value is in using this guidance that starting at the beginning, here in the Hinayana, with the first noble truth. In practicing Buddha Dharma, you cannot bypass anything. You have to begin with the Hinayana and the first noble truth. Having done so, Mahayana and Vajrayana will come along naturally. It's like a journey where new understandings come into view. And by the way, it's a personal journey. Each of us has to find our own way, right? Each of us has come to the Dharma with our own particular causes and conditions, life experience that has brought us here. But in fact, I believe what brings all of us here in one way or another is suffering. So we set out on the path with our own individual stories of who we are and strategies for navigating life. And that's the stuff we work with. That the teachings point the way and give us an understanding of the experiences we encounter along the way. But each of us has to find our own way. And trying to find a shortcut is not time well spent. Like the Buddha, we have to work it out step by step. And finally, he says, the reality is that we are all trapped in samsaric neurosis, everybody without exception. It is best that you work with reality rather than ideals. That is a good place to begin. And that's the end of that chapter.
So we can have a discussion. Fred.
Yeah, I had the same question or observation Barry did about suffering being so later. And I think this is Chogyam Trungpa's teaching style of the backwards ati, starting from view and then working our way back. It's like,
Yeah, go to the next one.
and when I look at it that way, I mean, it's so profound to come along that way, because you see that an obstacle towards this view is we have all sorts of attachments, and they create suffering, and then that suffering, when we see that in my experience, it seems to become the fuel or the motivation, because there's endless amounts of suffering in samsara.
Yep.
In a way, we got the backwards path tonight, because the first chapter was on Vipassana, which is a very profound move towards sanity and waking up. It's the total clear awareness and appreciation for what is happening in the present moment. With Vipassana, the world becomes much more vivid. Colors are actually brighter. Sounds more luminous and intense. All the senses are magnified because we're not lost in concept. He starts with that, and then he goes back into the next chapter, which is all about how we get lost in confusion, in suffering, in wishing things were different, in the anxiety of that. So in a way, we're doing the backwards path of life here too. He had great faith in all of us, that we all had enlightened genes and could recognize enlightened mind. That was Kensei Rinpoche who coined that phrase in describing Trungpa Rinpoche's teachings, Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, called it the backwards path of Ati. And there's a book, actually, that I forgot the name of the person who wrote it, called The Backwards Path of Ati, one of Rinpoche's students, about Rinpoche's teachings. Philip.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you, Barry, for your presentations. They were great. They were very lucid and straightforward. So I think one of the reasons, Barry, he starts on page 380 is because if you start with a line like this, and I quote, to begin with, you could give up your scheme of what you ideally want in your life, pleasure, enjoyment, happiness. You could give up those possibilities altogether. 99 people out of 100 will close the book at that point, right? And they'll go looking for another book.
Yep.
How did this make it into the self-help section?
Absolutely, Philip. I was saying that the other day that it was in regard to the way of the Bodhisattva, but it applies to this and many other Buddhist literature. That if it was published these days, it would be in the pop psychology section or in the self-help section or the self-improvement section or whatever it's called, right? But on the hi Fred's son. Anyway, but and then my second thought was exactly what you had said. People, I see this as good news, and I'm always surprised, not always surprised, but it's always, when it arises, it's always fresh. When my clients don't experience this as good news, right? Because if they come in wanting escape from their suffering, but they think they're just going the wrong way about changing their external circumstances. And they want me to tell them the right way, what they're doing wrong in changing their wives or their husbands or their jobs or, whatever, right? And,
Yes.
and so when I add my perspective to it, they don't necessarily quit, but sometimes they do. But the ones that stick with it, with my perspective, are a self-selected group. So it works well. But but there are people who just do not experience this as good news, right?
People
Because
are just
instead of
absolutely
controlling
unwilling,
their
absolutely unwilling to accept the reality of the world they live in. So you make your living dealing with addictive behaviors, and they try everything, even though it doesn't work. It doesn't work 100 times in a row. Affairs, new cars, alcohol, drugs, fiction, movies, all this stuff, all this escape behavior, over and over and over and over and over, it's demonstrated to them it does not work. Well, they think it's because I haven't tried it enough.
exactly, right, because it almost works.
It worked for a minute.
And it always almost works.
Yeah.
Anything that always almost works is going to be addictive because we think we're just doing it wrong, so it doesn't work completely, instead of abandoning the whole construct, right?
Yeah. That is
I
the
think,
vicious cycle of samsara.
yeah, I think Mika had something to say a minute ago. You would have to unmute yourself.
You're muted, Mika.
There we go. Now I'm unmuted, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I don't know exactly how to phrase this, but I think that certainly accepting the truth of suffering, the first noble truth, is key, as everybody has said. But more and more, I focus on the fact that that there's a big difference between recognizing something and accepting something. And the biggest problem is feeling that something should be different and other than it is. That once, I mean, this is a little story that Eckhart Tolle said about a woman who was in pain and was visited by uh, enlightened person, and helped the woman recognize that her suffering was coming from her feeling that it should be different, that she should not be in pain. And then once she was able to accept the fact that she was in pain, that this problem was a problem, and it just, there was no need for it to be any different. It is what it was. Her suffering lessened. The pain stayed, but her suffering lessened. Um, and I think that uh, more and more, I think that uh, the key is not so much in recognizing, but the key is in accepting that things don't have to be different. That my pain or everybody's pain comes from the illusion that something should be other than it is. And since it should be other than it is, it's my responsibility to make it other than it is. And to the extent that that's not happening, I'm at fault and I suffer doubly. I suffer from the incident, whatever's happening. I suffer from my lack of changing it, and I suffer from what that says about myself. And so all of a sudden, the suffering is tripled, and then leads to all other avenues of suffering. But it all comes from just not accepting the actuality of the situation. It all comes from my feeling that it should be different, and therefore, if it's this way, it's something I did. Um, and if I think about it, I realize that's even the case in lesser things. If I'm looking at a sunset, the other day I was looking at a moonrise, and it caught my attention, and it was beautiful. But if I'm really examine that I experienced, I realized it was somewhat lessened by the immediate thought, the immediate regret that I hadn't looked up a minute earlier, because I would have seen it starting earlier. And then there are feelings of, boy, I should be looking at moonrises more often because they're so beautiful. And so the whole experience was lessened uh, by my immediately thinking that something should be different in this experience than it was. Uh, I mean, it was great that I could recognize it, I guess. Otherwise, I continue, with my eyes down on the road. But what the experience had to offer was almost immediately marred by my wishing it could be somehow different. And I think that's really crucial. I think it gets overlooked sometimes. It's certainly something I'm thinking about a lot, and that's just my commentary.
Thank you. Great.
Yeah, thanks, Misha. That is great, and it does often get overlooked, and that's the difference between what you're describing and when it gets overlooked. That recognition in and of itself is a healing, recognition. Because we jump to these stories so quickly, so habitually, sometimes we just don't even notice them. But I would be surprised if your practice did not contribute to that recognition. Yeah. Thanks,
Sarah.
Misha.
But aren't these teachings telling us that we should allow all of those thoughts,
Allow what?
allow all of those thoughts to arise and fall, but just allow them without letting it mar our experience?
Mhm. Sure. If you're critical of your thoughts, well, that's another, klesha, another kind of anxiety. I shouldn't be having this kind of thought. And at some point, you just got to practice awareness, which is what the first chapter we had tonight was all about, Vipassana, the awareness that sees it all without judgment.
it can actually be kind of humorous, I'm experiencing, to see all of those thoughts.
Yes, yes, it could be hilarious. I used to say too often, I crack myself up. And the emergence of curiosity and of humor, you see, that's where the light is starting to come in.
The first time I ever heard Trungpa Rinpoche give a talk, the subject was sense of humor and how important it is. I think of the two old Jewish men, and one says to the other, Moshe, how's by you? Moshe replies, Oi, you shouldn't ask. Don't ask. And bring it up.
Or everything was fine until you asked, right?
Yeah.
My variation on that. And he says that directly in the chapter that I read, that we should not be too serious. We shouldn't be too frivolous either, but we should definitely shouldn't be too serious. We have to be
It
a little
also
bit.
says that our basic anxiety is produced because fundamentally we're Buddhas. We all have basic goodness, or another way, bodhicitta, awakened mind, and that it just creates a contrast, like light and dark. And if you have light, you're going to have dark. If you have dark, you're going to have light. And our basic nature is so fundamentally good, it creates the anxiety, or the anxiety arises in contrast to it. And we could observe without comment. Vipassana, awareness practice. Ultimately, with awareness practice, this world becomes much more vivid because we're seeing the whole world in Vipassana, and we're seeing it without concept of any kind, including good and bad and judgments, beautiful, ugly, but it's even beyond that, without even names. You're just seeing it raw, the phenomenal world, as it arises and passes. And the same thing with thoughts. You see them without judging them in Vipassana practice. It's really the key.
And a hush fell over the crowd.
Ringu Tulku was here in Boulder about a week or 10 days ago, whatever long it was, 2 weeks ago. And he ended every talk by asking for jokes. He asked people to tell jokes. So I'll tell you the one that I told him is appropriate for the moment, and then I'll call calling you Fred. So I took the mic and I said, before I became a Buddhist, I used to worry about my life. Now I worry about my next life. Fred, you had one.
That's a good one. That's really good.
Yeah. There was a couple who used to do stand-up routines at this New York Shambhala Center. He was a Buddhist. And that was one of his. I'm stealing it.
Yeah, I've actually thought about doing that, and I can't tell you how many times that impulse arises to just try to teach Buddhism in like stand up. But like what what's the deal with suffering? Why are we so addicted to it? Why do we love our problems so much? And then of course somebody's like, I don't love my problems, and people get defensive. But I find, for physical pain, right? If you actually sit with physical pain sometimes and just see it, it that's the beginning of healing. You start to sort of intuitively understand what you need. And I've had a lot of physical pain, how to do it. And I remember there was a kid. I was at the trampoline park. I don't know if anyone's ever been to like Sky Zone at these big trampoline parks. A kid did a flip and landed on his arm, broke it, split it right about there.
Hmm.
And I looked around, I heard it, I felt it, and I see, I'm like, all right, is there anybody to take care of this kid? I'm like, all right, nobody knows what they're doing. Because it was like 18 to like 20-year-old kids being like monitors of the park. And I sort of knew like first aid, just carry the splint. And what came out of me when I told the kid is I said, don't avoid what's happening. Take a look, you're okay. And the more you feel what's happening now, you're going to heal so well. Your arm's going to grow back so much better because you're young, your bones are so supple. And I wouldn't have understood that or had that strength to deal with that if I didn't suffer myself and had bones broken. I can't even remember offhand how many times I've had bones broken. And suffering, you really learn something from it. Even if it's just, you keep touching that hot stove, exactly how it's hot, right? I'm like, oh, I could just touch it and not burn myself too bad. Maybe like spending too much for whiskey going out on your credit card. How much could I spend until, I could just avoid the bill and defer it for as long as possible, right? There is intelligence there. And we just have to that confusion and seeing that, like, taking the me out of it really shifts it in some way. But it takes a bit of patience too, is what I'm learning, right? We can't rush it because then that's aggression.
I think you're talking about that line from the Four Dharmas of Gampopa. May confusion dawn as suffering. I mean, excuse me, it's confusion dawn as, what is it? Enlightenment.
Yep. Exactly.
Sorry.
I like your version. Make confusion not as
Like the first one better.
Yeah. Well, in a way, it's true, and because also, but because of what Fred was saying, I mean, you have to know suffering to be compassionate. You can't be compassionate without knowing suffering, right? I think.
Well, they say that the enlightened ones look at us and see our suffering and have great compassion for it.
Mm.
And yeah, I'm remembering the poem you read me once, John, of Chogyam Trungpa's first student in the West. What was his name? Kingo Dawa, right?
Kungadawa, yeah.
And in the poem, he's crying over bacon and eggs, missing Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and he's recalling fondly how he cured his depression by punching him in the nose. Permanent cure of depression.
Yep. That was a beautiful poem.
It really was. The contrast, the crying, the bacon and eggs, and just. I remember I read that. I'm like, I would take that any day of the week. Punch in the nose and my depression is cured. Well,
Yeah, there were some really beautiful poems in that collection. If anyone wants it, it's by, I'm not sure whether it's the author's name is his English name, he was an Englishman, or whether his name is Richard Arthur, Tarthure, or Kungadawa, which was his refuge name, that he used a lot. But the book is called The Medium of the Breath. And there are some spectacular poems in there, especially the title poem, The Medium of the Breath, which is all about Tonglen. It's really beautiful and fierce. Wow. And then there's this poem to the kind root guru Chökyi Gyatso, which is his root guru. Kunga was, Richard Arthur was Trungpa Rinpoche's first student when he came to the West. He met him in London. And when he came to the United States, he was his closest student and the first one to be authorized to teach. And he was just a marvelous person, totally devoted to the Dharma.
Yeah, it's under his English name, Richard Arturo.
Richard Arthur. He also accompanied Rinpoche to Tagdsang in Bhutan, going to Bhutan, where Rinpoche received the sadhana Mahamudra as a terma. And then Richard and Rinpoche translated it into English together. Now, Rinpoche's English was poor at that point, and Kunga, of course, Richard, had no Tibetan. So there were mistakes and sort of things that could have been better. And they were corrected later by the Nalanda Translation Committee. But Trungpa Rinpoche felt that the translation that he and Richard did in Bhutan, in the caves there, was itself Dharma. And so that's what we still chant today. So I'm just recommending it to you. I could send you the poems.
What was the name of the book? What was the name of the book?
The Medium of the Breath.
The Medium of the Breath?
Yeah, the medium of the breath. When you do Tonglen, you're going out on the medium of the breath. You're breathing in, going out. And that's the title of a poem, the first poem. You want to hear a poem?
Sure.
Yes? Hold on a
Yes.
second.
Sure.
I'll read you the one that Fred talked about. Or maybe I can share it on screen even. Just take me a minute to find it. Here we go. Okay. Wait a second. Let's get this. See if I can share it on screen. It's not easy to read because, here it is. Remembering the kind root guru Chökyi Gyatso, the 11th Trungpa Tulku. Why am I crying into bacon and eggs at Lick Skillet Cafe? That's a cafe up in Netherlands, outside of Boulder. Because it's Shambhala Day, and I should be with my Dharma brothers and sisters. Because I found you, Chogyam Trungpa Chökyi Gyatso, 30 years ago, and when I went to meet you at Bedulf, you knew I was coming, though I had told no one where I was going. Because you saw right through me and punched me on the nose to wake me up when I needed it. Because you named me Kungadawa, all joyful moon, and I never suffered from depression again. Because when I was losing my mind, you promised I would never escape from you, and I never could. Because you pointed out ordinary mind when I least expected it, and said, welcome to the circle. And by the way, ordinary mind is basically the quintessence of Vipassana. Because you gave me Mahā'ati teachings so casually, It took 25 years to realize how rare and precious the oral instructions, because you entered me into the path of the profound Mantrayana and gave my life meaning it never had before, because you took me to India, Bhutan, and Sikkim, and empowered me with Dorje Trollo Karmapakshi, wrathful embodiment of crazy wisdom, because you told me I could actually attain enlightenment in this very lifetime, and I believed you. Because I swore an oath of allegiance, and now there is no turning back. Because you told me in New Delhi there would be a rainbow in the sky at your cremation, and 20 years later I lived to see it. Because you were completely outrageous and inscrutable, your realization vast as the sky, and the ignorant saw only a drunken womanizer. Because you could read my mind always, and there was no place to hide. Because I was naked and exposed every time I saw you or thought of you, and still am. Because I had an out-of-body experience on acid, and you alone were able to bring me back. Because you never gave up on me, even though I was your most obstinate student. Because you once despaired of being able to bring the Dharma to the West and took too many sleeping pills and we nearly lost you. Because you gave all your money to an old beggar woman in Bodh Gaya and your girlfriend got angry at you. Because your mother-in-law hated you, called you nigger, swore she would crush you underfoot like a cockroach, and you transformed the vituperative South African farmer's daughter into dignified, lovable, genteel Lady Pybus. Because the geese are honking in the crystal winter sky, and I know you are laughing at some cosmic joke. Because if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be here, and I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. I supplicate space, Chikigatso, in space, separable space and awareness, Chikigatso, bliss and emptiness, Chikigatso, Lord of the realm of non-thought, Chikigatso. Please look on your heart sun with compassion, Chikigatso. Grant your blessings so that I may always remember you with devotion. Grant your blessings so that I will practice the Dharma with unwavering diligence. Grant your blessings so that the seeds you planted may ripen and blossom into realization. Chikigatso, Chikigatso, ocean of Dharma, I'm drowning, I'm drowning. I can taste the salt of you right now, trickling down cheek, flavoring eggs at Lick Skillet Cafe. And the waitress is looking at me kind of funny. Are you all right? She's asking me. Yes, yes, I'm fine. I'm fine. Everything is fine. Thank you.
Hmm. Wow.
Oh,
Yeah, it's really beautiful.
Oh
I
my
loved
God.
I really loved him. He was one of the first. Yeah. I remember, I'll tell you straight, Konga, the first time I had, almost the first time I think I ever spoke to him. It was at what's now Kermit Choling. It was then called Tail of the Tiger. And I was there in 1970. And it was a ramshackle farmer's house, woodcutter's house, actually. And one day I walked into the so-called library. It was just this crummy little room with some shelves in it and books. And Konga was sitting there on the floor meditating. And when I saw him, I said, "Oh, no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you." He just looked up at me with this huge grin and said, "Interrupt me from what?" That's Vipassana. We had him come to the Westchester Buddhist Center some years ago before he died, and he gave a teaching on the sadhana of Mahamudra. Including an abbreviated version of the sadhana of Mahamudra, so when you don't have time. And if anybody wants it, I could give it to them.
Hmm.
Send me an email. I think I've got it still.
Wow.
Wow, it's 7 o'clock. Oh my goodness. sleep. It took up the.
Actually, it's
Oh.
9 o'clock.
So I'll put the chants up. Who's leading the chants tonight?
Yeah, let's wing it. Everybody just saying.
No, we'll have cacophony then.
So,
Okay, you can do it. Prayer for peace and dedication and merit. Ready? Everybody. By the blessings and light and
lightning,
compassion,
compassion,
by the power of my
positive actions 3 times, and my prayers of pure aspiration.
May
Wars,
wars,
conflicts, epidemics, and all other
dissolve
dissolve in this world.
May the
May
earth
the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance and well-being.
They
And
all
all learn to live lovingly with each other.
By this
By
merit,
this
By
merit,
this
may
merit,
may it
it
defeat
defeat
the enemy
wrongdoing
from the stormy
stormy
waves
waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death.
the
From the
oceans
oceans of sorrow, may it free all beings.
by the
By the confidence in the golden sun, the great east.
may the
May
lotus
the dark
cloud
ignorance
wisdom bloom. May the dark
May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled.
May all
May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Barry. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you.